1942, the fate of the free world rested on exhausted men in the Pacific. A single miscalculation meant annihilation. Welcome to our third video, uncovering the untold story of the most critical 5 minutes in history. The Pacific Ocean was a graveyard of shattered ambitions. Just 6 months earlier, the attack on Pearl Harbor had awakened a sleeping giant, but the giant was bleeding. They captured island after island, establishing a massive defensive perimeter. The Allies were reeling, desperate for a victory, to stop the relentless advance of the rising Sunday. Yamamoto believed that by threatening Midway, he could lure the remaining American carriers into a trap. He would smash them with his overwhelming fleet, securing Japanese dominance for generations. But the Americans had a secret weapon. Deep in a damp, windowless basement in Pearl Harbor, a team of brilliant cryptanalysts was working around the clock. They were breaking the seemingly unbreakable Japanese naval code, known as JN-25. It was grueling work, sifting through thousands of intercepted messages to find patterns in complex numerals. They couldn't read every message, but they pieced together a chilling puzzle. The next major Japanese target was designated simply as AF, and they needed to know what it meant. The Japanese Armada was a floating fortress. They had 4 massive fleet carriers, escorted by heavy battleships, cruisers, and hundreds of the world's most experienced combat pilots. These pilots were veterans of Pearl Harbor. They were flying the legendary Mitsubishi A6M0, a fighter that outclimbed and outmaneuvered anything the Allies had in the sky. But knowing where the enemy is and surviving are 2 different things. The American fleet was heavily outnumbered, facing an invincible force. Let's look at the staggering odds they faced that morning. In contrast, the American force was a makeshift fleet. They had only 3 carriers, the Enterprise, the Hornet, and the battered Yorktown, miraculously repaired in just 72 hours. The American pilots were largely green, lacking combat experience. Many were flying outdated aircraft, and the torpedo squadrons were equipped with the disastrous Mark 13 torpedoes. These torpedoes were notoriously unreliable, often running too deep or failing to detonate. The men who flew them knew they were essentially sitting ducks in the sky. On the morning of June 4th, the sky over the Pacific was clear and cold. The American scout planes launched into the dawn, their engines roaring against the silence. They flew out into the vast blue expanse, desperately searching for the elusive enemy fleet. The tension in the cockpits was palpable, every shadow looking like an enemy hull. Meanwhile, the Japanese launched their first strike against Midway Island. The island's defenders fought valiantly, scrambling their aging marine fighters to intercept the incoming swarm. It was a brutal, one-sided dogfight. The American marine fighters were swatted out of the sky by the agile Japanese Zeros, but the island took heavy damage and refused to surrender. The commander of the Japanese strike force radioed back to the flagship Akagi. He reported that a second strike was needed to finish off the island's defenses. This was the exact moment the battle pivoted. Admiral Nagumo faced a nightmare scenario, forced to make a split-second decision that would either secure victory or doom his entire fleet to the ocean depths. Nagumo's planes were currently armed with land bombs to hit Midway again. But then, a scout plane spotted American ships in the distance, throwing Nagumo into paralyzing indecision. He ordered the land bombs to be swapped back out for torpedoes to attack the American ships. On the crowded flight decks, crews worked frantically in a chaotic, deadly ballet. They were moving heavy explosives and highly volatile aviation fuel in a panic. The flight decks became a tinderbox, cluttered with unspent ordnance and fueled planes waiting to launch. While the Japanese were distracted, the American torpedo squadrons arrived. Flying slow, vulnerable devastators, they attacked without fighter cover. It was a suicide mission from the very start. The Japanese combat air patrol intercepted them. The slow torpedo bombers were torn to shreds. Almost all of them were shot down before they could even get close to their targets. They scored 0 hits. The sacrifice seemed entirely in vain, a tragic waste of brave men. But their desperate attack had a profound, unintended effect on the battlefield above them. By forcing the Japanese combat air patrol to dive down to sea level, they left the high altitudes completely undefended. The sky above the Japanese fleet was suddenly wide open. What happened in the next 5 minutes is legend. The dive bombers pushed over into their dives, aiming for the vulnerable flight decks below. The window of opportunity was razor thin, and the margin for error was zero. At exactly 10:20 a.m., the sky above the Japanese fleet darkened with a new threat. 3 squadrons of American SBD Dauntless dive bombers had arrived unnoticed, hovering at 14,000 feet. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey led the Enterprise Air Group. He had spotted a Japanese destroyer speeding to rejoin the main fleet, and he followed its wake directly to the enemy carriers. McCluskey's dive bombers targeted the Kaga and the Akagi. The planes plummeted from the sky, the wind screaming over their wings as the pilots fought the G-forces. At the last possible second, they pulled up, releasing their payloads directly onto the wooden decks. The bombs fell like judgment from the heavens, piercing the flight decks. The explosions tore through the hangar decks below, detonating the fully fueled and armed aircraft. Massive fireballs erupted into the sky, turning the carriers into floating infernos. Simultaneously, the Yorktown's air group found the Soryu. Despite facing intense anti-aircraft fire, the American pilots pressed their attacks, landing 3 devastating direct hits that doomed the 3rd carrier. In just 5 minutes, the balance of power in the Pacific was completely inverted. 3 of Japan's 4 elite fleet carriers were burning out of control, their air groups decimated. It was a miraculous victory, but the battle wasn't over. The 4th Japanese carrier, the Hiryu, was still afloat, preparing to launch a desperate, deadly counterstrike against the battered American fleet. The Hiryu immediately launched a counterattack. Their dive bombers found the USS Yorktown, managing to score 3 direct hits despite the heavy anti-aircraft fire, engulfing the carrier in flames. Damage control parties fought bravely to save the ship, patching holes and pumping out water. For a moment, it seemed the Yorktown might be saved and towed back to port. But the Hiryu launched a second wave of torpedo bombers. These torpedoes found their mark, ripping through the Yorktown's hull. The ship finally listed heavily, and the order was given to abandon ship, but the Americans were relentless. Later that afternoon, scout planes finally located the elusive Hiryu. A massive strike of dive bombers was launched, tracking the Japanese carrier through the fading light. The Hiryu was hit by multiple bombs, its fires spreading out of control. The next morning, the mighty carrier slipped beneath the waves, taking the last of Japan's offensive carrier power down with it. The Battle of Midway was over. The United States had lost 1 carrier and about 150 aircraft, but the Japanese had lost 4 irreplaceable carriers and hundreds of their best pilots. The loss of those veteran pilots broke the back of Japanese naval air power. Midway didn't just stop their advance. It fundamentally shifted the momentum of the entire war in the Pacific. The aftermath of the battle was a haunting sight. The ocean was littered with the debris of shattered aircraft and burning ships. Survivors clung to rafts, watching the once proud fleet sink. Admiral Yamamoto, watching from his massive battleship far to the west, refused to accept the defeat initially. He even considered a surface battle, but his staff finally convinced him to order a retreat. The victory at Midway was a triumph of intelligence, courage, and sheer luck. The codebreakers provided the map, but it was the bravery of the pilots and sailors that sealed the fate of the enemy. Looking back, it's easy to focus on grand strategies. But Midway reminds us that the fate of nations comes down to the split-second decisions of ordinary people in extraordinary, terrifying circumstances. The men who flew those outdated torpedo planes, knowing they likely wouldn't return, embodied the ultimate sacrifice. Their willingness to face certain death bought the crucial minutes needed for the dive bombers. The codebreakers in the damp basements of Pearl Harbor fought a different kind of war, one of numbers and logic. Their brilliant deduction of the target was the invisible shield that protected the fleet. Admiral Nimitz's calm leadership in the face of overwhelming odds proved that a cool head could outmaneuver raw power. He trusted his intelligence, trusted his men, and took a calculated gamble that paid off. Midway's legacy extends far beyond the Pacific. It proved intelligence could overcome numerical superiority, serving as the turning point that allowed the Allies to go on the offensive all the way to Tokyo. In the years that followed, the U.S. Navy industrial machine churned out new carriers, new planes, and new pilots at a rate the Japanese could never match. Midway was the gateway to that overwhelming might. The lessons of those 5 minutes in June 1942 are still studied in military academies today. They teach the importance of initiative, the value of accurate intelligence, and the unpredictable chaos of combat. Today, the waters around Midway Atoll are a protected wildlife refuge. The coral reefs have reclaimed the battleground, and the skies are filled with albatrosses instead of fighter planes. Yet, beneath that tranquil surface lie the rusted hulls of the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. They rest in the deep, silent monuments to the men who fought and died in the most critical 5 minutes of the war. The Battle of Midway remains a testament to human endurance and the unpredictable nature of war. It is a story of how a few moments of brilliance and bravery can alter the course of human history forever. That brings us to the end of today's deep dive into the Pacific War's most pivotal 5 minutes. If you found this fascinating, hit like and don't forget to subscribe for our next video.